Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. It's May 25th, 2021. It's amazing how fast that happened. You are at, well, first of all, you are with Ulrike Schaede. I'm a professor of Japanese business, UC San Diego, and director of JFIT, our Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, which is our Japan Center at UC San Diego. We are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. If you're interested in our course offering and all the things we do here, go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. The website for JFIT is jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that website, you can find a tab called News and Media, where you can sign up for our bi-weekly San Diego Japan newsflash, the Un-News from Japan. We bring to you some stories that you would not ordinarily find in the news. And right over next to it is the Japan Zoomina tab, where you can sign up, register for our events, and watch our past events. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Or if all of that is way too complicated, just go to my own website, which is tongue-in-cheek, thejapanologist.com. And our Zoomina is a weekly event. We meet every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. And of course, today we talk about environmental advocacy with Mary Alice Haddad. Coming up next week is a conversation about e-commerce and the digital transformation in Japan with Ivan Bokowski, who is a digital marketing executive in Japan. Then we'll talk about entrepreneurship. Then we'll have Mireia Solis to talk about Japan's new role in shaping the liberal trading order. And then we'll have a reprisal of the entrepreneurship theme with Bob Eberhard, who's going to talk about the myth about Japanese entrepreneurship. And then we'll have Lisa Friedman talking about women in Japanese society and what the female stereotype and the gendered stereotype in Japan allows and hinders women in Japan from doing. So our Zoominars are recorded. You can find past events on our website, as I just explained. And during our conversation today, feel free to type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. I will weave them into our conversation, but refer to you only by name, by first name, so that your privacy is secured. Oh, wait, I wanted to show the book. Wait, before I introduce Mary Alice, one more slide. I thought I had one more slide. Here we go. This is her book, Effective Advocacy, Lessons from East Asia's Environmentalists. So I have Mary Alice Haddad with me. So now I stop the share and there she is. Mary Alice, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let me introduce you. You're the John E. Andrus Professor of Government and a Professor of East Asian Studies, also chair, and a Professor of Environmental Studies. So you're a three-time professor at Wesleyan University in beautiful Connecticut. And you've been there since 2004. Before that, you've earned your BA from Amherst and your MA and PhD on the West Coast from the University of Washington in Seattle. You've done a lot of things, interesting things. You've been a visiting scholar at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the Keio University in Tokyo, the Kobe University, and been a fellow at East Asian Institute in various places, including Korea. That's important because we're going to talk about East Asia today. And so you've been to all of these places, and I look forward to talking to you about those. You've won many awards and grants, and you've written 4 books. The first one was Politics and Volunteering in Japan. The second, Building Democracy in Japan. The third was a co-authored, co-edited book called NIMBY is Beautiful. And that was about local activism and environmental innovation around the world. And I sensed that maybe your new book, Effective Advocacy, kind of grew out of that a little bit. But this new one is a solo book. And so today we want to talk about that. It's brand new, it came out in March. And it's open access. So people can read it for free if they go online and Google Effective Advocacy and MIT Press. I believe it'll be there. So welcome to the show, Mary Alice. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Ulrike. For your very generous introduction. I as I'm getting older, I feel like the introductions are getting longer, and I'm like, I should be 75 with all the stuff that you're saying. So I appreciate that, and I'm flattered to be offered the honor to be as part of the Japan Zoominar. I've been lurking in the audience many times, and I'm really impressed and feeling very grateful that we're hopefully coming to the end of a crazy year. And one of the highlights of the year for me has been the sort of spread of these kinds of Zoominars, and the fact that I don't have to fly out to San Diego from the East Coast to give a talk. I can just come up from dinner and log onto my machine. It's really been one of the great pleasures for me, and enhancing our scholarship and our global connection, I think.
Of course, it was lovely to have you in San Diego.
Yeah,
there is a dimension to that we're missing, but let me just thank you for that. I'll actually continue this, so we'll see what happens to the audience and the size of the audience and so forth. But my plan is to continue this precisely for this reason, right? We can just go and listen in and not have to travel. So
that's my hope. My hope is that we can do both and not have to just pick one from the other, because it's been a pleasure to be able to hear so many great scholars over the year.
So what's the new book about?
Okay, so you didn't give me very much time, so I'm going to do sort of a highlights version, and I'll just have a few slides to give a little bit of an overview of the project. So it's called Effective Advocacy in East Asia, and it grew out of a puzzle that I had. So my last book, as you mentioned, was on democracy in Japan, and I was really intrigued. In my teaching, I noticed that the environment was the first issue area where citizens in East Asia, both in China and Japan, and also South Korea, and also Taiwan, advocated to their government and won. So they made demands against the government, and then they won those demands. And so that was the first reason I get interested in the issue area. And as I got into it, I was investigating this puzzle, which is essentially, as we all know, those in the audience know, East Asia as a whole is quite hostile to political advocacy of all kinds. And it's dominated by pro-business governments. But you actually have very progressive environmental policy across the region. I thought that was very puzzling. You don't have big environmental movements. You haven't had large government programs. So how did you end up with this pro-environmental policy? And my feeling was that the environmental advocates in East Asia must be doing something right, and maybe we could learn from them. So that was why I went in to do this study. And I designed the study with the 4 countries. So Japan was a mature democracy. South Korea and Taiwan are new democracies, and China is not a democracy, because I thought that democracy would matter. So what I expected going into the study was that the strategies that advocates used in Japan, that there would be a whole bunch of them, because it was a democratic country and has been for a long time. And the strategies that advocates used and were successful in South Korea and Taiwan would be numerous, but smaller. And that in China, there would be a very narrow set of strategies that advocates could use and actually succeed. And so I was also interested in testing both the sort of variation across the East Asian countries and whether East Asia was different than the rest of the world somehow. So I went and talked to a whole bunch of people. I talked to people in China, I talked to people in all 4 countries, I talked to people in the government and business and grassroots NGOs, big NGOs, and I was shocked by what I found. What I found was that almost everybody I talked to named the same set of things that mattered. When I asked the sort of open-ended question, what do environmental advocates do that work? They gave me the same set. And this is the set. So they said, make friends on the inside. So nobody in this audience will be surprised to hear that if you are an NGO, an environmental NGO, and you hire the former Minister of the Environment to be on the board of direction of your NGO, that's a good idea. That is an effective strategy. That's an effective strategy in Beijing. It works in Tokyo. It works in Seoul. It works in DC. It works in Bonn. It works in Buenos Aires. It doesn't matter where you are. It's effective. Similarly, if you have an idea of a policy that works and you can get it to work in one spot, and then you can use that spot and you pilot it, and you can get that model to proliferate sort of often to other towns and other cities, and it can proliferate horizontally, and then it can move up and become regional, national policy, or even international policy. That's also a very effective strategy. If you can find that sweet spot, Ulrike knows a lot about this, that sweet spot where your pro-environmental action makes money, that's really good. That works pretty much everywhere also. Education, both at the grassroots level and at the elite level, is very effective. And art, this was a little bit of a surprise, but art really mattered. It wasn't a huge strategy that people mentioned all the time, but it mentioned consistently, and many people in all the countries talked about how it was really important to getting people to pay attention, to getting people to care. In the language of one of the artists that I spoke with, she said, you know, you can throw these numbers at people all the time and you can make their brain understand that climate change matters and that pollution is a bad thing, but you can't make them care about it. But through the art of narrative in filmmaking or through art installations, you can sort of engage their heart and you can make them want to do something about it. And then finally, this is not exactly a strategy, but it was something that showed up regularly, is there are people, individual people who are just so innovative that they change the game for everybody else. And that was also a common thread. So the book itself is organized in these 9 chapters where I cover 5 of the strategies. I do not cover environmental education in a chapter because there's a lot written on that, and I didn't find that my own work had anything particularly useful to add. After studying the large N situation, giving a little bit of history, I come up with a new model for why these strategies work. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in Q&A. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll give you a couple of statistics, and then I'll tell some of my favorite stories, and then I'll wrap it up because I don't have very much time, and we can have cover more in Q&A. So in terms of which strategies were effective and where, this is a sort of an events analysis. I took a bunch of environmental events that were culled from Factiva's news. I chose the time period between 2005 and 2009 because that time period was recent enough that you could feel like it was capturing sort of contemporary environmental politics, but it was old enough that most of the events that I was capturing were done. So I would be able to find out whether the advocates were actually successful in what they were trying to get, or they weren't successful. And the pattern that you'll see here is that East Asia is not particularly strange or different. The strategies that are effective in East Asia, and those of you that are familiar with the East Asian sort of model of civic activism, there's lots of work with the government, work locally, work for business, work in education. These kinds of embedded forms of advocacy are common everywhere. In contrast, the kinds of advocacy strategies that are sort of get a lot of press in the West, like lawsuits and protests, are actually not that common. It's not just that they're not that common in East Asia, they're not that common anywhere. They do happen, and they are important as a part of the sort of broad scope of strategies that advocates can use, but they're not as common or as effective as the other ones that are highlighted in my study. So now for some good stories. So I'm going to share 2 of my favorite stories. I do have plenty from other parts of East Asia, and I'm happy to talk about those in Q&A. Since this is the Japan Zoominar, I'm pulling 2 of my favorite ones that are sort of coming out of Japan. And one of them is the Kitakyu composting network that comes out of Kitakyushu, Japan. And it emerged because the city of Kitakyushu in Japan and its sister city, Surabaya, or one of its sister cities, Surabaya in Indonesia, had a relationship with one another as sister cities, and they would send, high school bands back and forth. And in the mid-2000s, Surabaya called up Kitakyushu and said, our landfill is filling up and we're going to run out of space like really soon. And is there any way that you can help us out with this? As many of you probably know, Kitakyushu has used to be an industrial pit and has recently pulled itself out of it, is now eco-city, and is branding itself with its sort of eco-resilient, eco-city resilient technology. And it's offering a lot of technical support to a wide variety of cities and businesses and others who want to turn their municipality into a more eco-friendly city. So they said, sure, let's see what we can do. They commissioned a local researcher to see if they could find out a better way of doing compost for food waste, household food waste. And the reason for that was that in Surabaya, like most places, household food waste is the largest by volume thing that's disposed of in your landfill. So if the city could figure out a way to pull its household food waste out of the landfill stream, this would be a huge benefit to not filling up the landfill so fast. So they came up with this good composting method and then worked with a local women's run NGO, the Pusdakota, you can see it in the far right. And they trained these handful of women how to use the composting method. And then they started very small in one neighborhood that then went into several neighborhoods in the city and distributed the composting buckets. And this worked. The logic of it makes a lot of sense. And it also was, once the investment happened, it was revenue neutral. So what happens is you give the composting buckets out, the households learn how to do the composting. They do the composting at home. They turn their kitchen scraps into compost. They can use the kitchen scrap, they can use the compost in their household gardens, or they can bring their bucket of compost to a collection site, like you can see down below on the far right, the collection site, and they will be paid for the compost. Not too much, a couple cents on the pound or a couple cents a kilo, but enough to both incentivize the composting and to generate money to buy more composting buckets for more households. And so what you saw was the space on the left, which is disgusting, and as those of you who've traveled in a developing country knows, are really common, these sort of empty lots where people just dump all their junk, got turned into the space on the right, in which you end up with a lovely community green space where the compost that's generated at home gets used for the plantings in the town. So this was a partnership between a Japanese city and an Indonesian city, and it worked really well. They reduced their landfill, the amount of volume that was going into the landfill by a whopping 30%. It was huge. I can't remember the tens of thousands of tons of CO2 that they resisted. But so now you have a model that works. Now you want to scale it. So they worked first with a network of cities inside Indonesia, then with a network of cities inside Southeast Asia. And now you can see from this graph, network of cities all around the world, where they introduced essentially the same model. Here's the composting system. We're going to work with a local NGO to train folks up in how to use it and then disseminate it that way, and you get the positive cycle working out. And so I'll move from the Kitakyushu story to one that everybody probably knows, which is, this is one of the stories that's highlighted in my Game Changer chapter, which is Yuriko Koike. So in 2005, she was the Minister of the Environment. And one of the reasons why she thought about that I call her a game changer is that in 2005, or prior to her Cool Biz campaign, it was still the case that pro-environmental behavior change was viewed as a sacrifice. It was spun in the media and thought about in the culture as, we have this lovely high consumptive lifestyle now that we all love, but the planet can't sustain it. So we're just going to have to cut back. And we're going to have to have less food and less meat and less heat and less travel and fewer cars and reuse clothing. And it's going to be like crummy, this life that we're going to have in our new pro-environmental lifestyle. But we just have to do it for the planet. And you can imagine that there's a small number of people that are into that idea, but most people are like, yeah, I don't really like that idea. And so what she was looking for was a way to change people's mindsets, a way for people to think, actually, a pro-environmental lifestyle is a better life. It's not a worse life. It's not a lesser life. It's a better life. And she launched this idea with the Cool Biz campaign, which, as many of you in the audience probably know, meant that you can now wear cool, nice looking short sleeve shirts to the office instead of that horrible tie that you hate. You now feel more comfortable when you're in the building rather than freezing and having to wear a jacket. And this Cool Biz spread from Japan, inside Japan, and then spread to South Korea. It spread across Southeast Asia. There was Cool UN in 2008, and actually Super Cool Biz, and actually most recently now in South Korea, in North Korea even. So even in North Korea, they have a Cool Biz campaign. So these are the kinds of stories that are in the book. And one of the main purposes of the book, and one of the reasons why I wanted to give this talk, and in giving talks like this, is that most climate change talks and talks about environmental politics are depressing. You leave the talk feeling like, oh my God, this problem is way too big and there's nothing I can do about it. And this book is not like that. This book is really about, there are people working hard on the ground. They're getting it done, and we can get it done. Like, we know how to get it done. We just have to do it. And there are a lot of people already doing it. So hopefully after you finish reading it, you can feel empowered and not disempowered in your own in your own lives and in terms of thinking about political efficacy in the world. Thanks.
Oh, that's great. So I've read the book. It's fantastic. So I recommend it, and it'll be great also for teaching. And I was impressed that you decided to structure it around these 7 commonalities that you found across East Asia in terms of strategies, rather than dividing it by country. And I think that that's very clever, because that way you can highlight these strategies. My first reaction to reading the book was a little bit like this naysayer thing that you just alluded to, right? So you have this, let's reframe this not as a sacrifice, but as, something that we all want to do. It makes us feel good, but it also doesn't have to be a sacrifice necessarily. So let's reframe it. But what if that's not possible? And since I study business, my first reaction was, okay, so what if it really is a trade-off, so that you can't reframe it as a winning proposition, at least not easily, right? So can you talk a little bit of maybe a case where something that really did not look as if it could be good for business was reframed in a way that you could use as a case study?
So I guess I'll respond to that. That's a great observation and a good question. I'll respond to it in 2 ways. And the first way is, you are totally right. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish and suggest that every single pro-environmental policy is going to be good for business, or that you can always find the sweet spot that's going to make everybody happy and that's going to be a win-win-win, that there's no losers in this setup. That's definitely true. There are losers in many of the political battles that get fought. Actually, one of the books that you didn't mention, we have I was part of an edited volume project that's called Greening East Asia. And in that one, we argue that there's sort of a rise of eco-developmental states in East Asia, where across the East Asian government, there's a focus on this pro-business path towards environmentalism. And you've seen it recently with all the net zero claims and lots of green growth initiatives. But what that leaves out is that works in that sweet spot, but outside of the sweet spot. And there are predictable places where that sweet spot fails. And the most predictable place is around issues of environmental justice. So across the region, you will find that marginalized communities, native or indigenous communities, are left out of the story, that they're often suppressed, that the environmental problems land on their shores, the environmental waste lands on their beaches. So it's not always a good story. I feel like the bad story is often told, so I didn't want to spend a lot of time doing that. So the second part of your question was, can I take an example of what is generally a negative and when it was used and turned into a positive? So I'll I'll pull one of my other, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think all my game changers sort of did this, but I'll pull the example of Ma Jun from China. He's a very, very well-known environmentalist, and he runs this organization called IPE, Institute for Policy and Environment in China. And he started in about 2006. And he had this amazing idea that's so simple, which is take all the little public government information about environmental pollution that's already out there, but it's located in random places, and put it together in one map. And then he has got all sorts of spin-offs on this, but I'll focus in on one, which is put it together on a searchable database. So now you have firm-based pollution data and whether or not a particular firm is violating China's environmental standards. Well, so who are the first companies that are interested in this? Walmart, right? The big global brands that are required by their missions for, or whatever, to maintain local standards. But because the Chinese government has not been doing a particularly good job of enforcing those standards, lots of their subcontractors and subcontractors are violating them and just paying a bribe or a fee. Well, now with this transparency database, IPE, the NGO, does not have the list of the subcontractors, but the companies do. So the companies can search the list to find out who their violators are, and then write letters, not nasty letters, supportive letters. So it comes from Atlanta, or it comes from wherever your CEO is, and it goes to your local subcontractor somewhere in the middle of China, and it says, "Dear so-and-so, we've noticed that you have this environmental violation, and we still want to work with you. So can we help you improve your environmental processes?" And if this works well, you end up turning what was a liability, particularly for Apple, so you probably remember the big scandal for Apple, into a positive for Apple. So Apple was blacklisted by IP initially and turned into a global scandal related to Foxconn and the other stuff. But then Apple worked with IPE and other NGOs to audit its supply chain, clean up, work with its subcontractors, and clean things up, and then was given sort of positive market response to its positive response to this. So that was sort of an example where you took something that was negative and were able to turn it around for business.
So, you know, a little bit of pressure, of course, all advocates want to pressure, you know, and so that could be healthy. So Lily wants to ask whether we can remind her what the title of the book is. So it's effective advocacy, right? And so that's my next question, actually. How do you measure efficacy, right?
Cool.
So what is the definition of success? And of course, I'm sure you've had this question thousands of times, but let me still ask you and give an example of what I mean. How do you show causality, right? So Minamata in Japan was a huge pollution issue. People were on the streets. It was not a good time in the 70s. Lots of people have written about this. And the solution for one of the solutions, so it was to cut that down, but another was for the government to say, okay, we're going to clean this up. We are not a clean place right now, so let's switch to nuclear power. I could argue whether that's a cleanup, but okay, that's what they did at the time. We, you know, in the 70s, we thought that was really, really cool. But they switched to nuclear power because that was also good for business, not because they were listening to the advocates, right? Or not necessarily because they were listening to the people. So how do you measure in this research? How do you measure efficacy and success and causality and all those?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So in the I don't do process tracing with cases. So as you noticed, I organized the book around these strategies. I did not organize the book around case studies, which how I was originally going to organize it. But I was doing the research in Tokyo in 2011. And there's a little bit of a disruption to that research. So my case study, I went to Kitakyushu to do interviews literally 2 days after the 3/11 earthquake. So my case study plan kind of fell apart. And I ended up being happier with how it turned out. But what I did was the interviews support the story around the efficacy. And then I had a couple different ways in which I measured efficacy statistically. One was through the event analysis. So I just went in and found environmental events of any kind. It wasn't necessarily a protest, it was any kind of environmental event. And it was just a binary. What was the thing the advocates were asking for? And did they get it? So that's not causality, right? All we know is that they were advocating, like you said about the Minamata, like they were advocating, and then did they get it in the end? So that's a correlational setup. And then I did something called a C-tree analysis, where I had a colleague of mine who's actually a forester help me in sort of a sophisticated setup where you can put all the, it's like a regression, but it's staged. So it gave me a sense of which kinds of things mattered more. So did the issue matter more? And did certain kinds of advocacy strategies at certain stages matter more? And did these strategies work at these issues or the other issues? So there's some statistical analysis that are used on those cases to try to find a little bit more support for why, or that these strategies then kind of caused or contributed to. I think there are very few where I can draw a direct line and say this form of advocacy directly caused this success or failure. But what I can do is say these configurations of advocacy tended to produce results. And then in the theoretical portion of the book, I sort of generate a theory for why that is and why these different kinds of advocacy work. And it has to do with the policymaking process. So to shortly answer your question, I can't draw that line as cleanly as one might, but I sort of do the best I can given how messy the real world is.
Right. Yeah, well, it's not possible. So you opened up two new questions. The policy making process. I want to go there next, but before we go there, can you talk a little bit about the people? So this is such a great research, right? So you go around East Asia and you talk to advocates, and then you understand that you have this conceptualization about leaning a little bit on network theory, that you really are more effective if you can become a node and have these connections and realize that politicians are part of networks, and then you kind of try to get into that network, and then have a game changer or kind of a charismatic person in the middle of this helps, right? So who are those people? Are they different from the ordinary Japanese that we know, or are they, what makes them different?
So the people that I talk to are just the ordinary people that are around in any kind of issue area. So you'd have, policymakers that are sitting in the room, the bureaucrats that are meeting in the bottom of some state entity that are actually deciding what the level of pollution that's going to be acceptable in this soil outside of the farm. There's a handful of people that are in those rooms. And there's advocates that are pushing on the outside who can't actually get into the room, but they're trying to get their ideas into the room. One of the things that showed up as, which many people in this audience will like to hear, of advocates that I wasn't looking for and hadn't expected, were academics. So academics are frequently these node people. And what I found, and sort of segueing to the I called it the connected stakeholder model, because it's the stakeholders that are connected. What I found when I was interviewing people is that in the West, especially in the US, there are all these ideas of conflict of interest. So the idea of policymaking is you have to have these stakeholders, and you need to have them different stakeholders, and they're in the room, and they all have a different stake, and they pound their stake in, and they fight for their cause, and they have a hierarchy of ideas, and this is my cause, I'm gonna fight for it. And this idea that they're all fighting, and then in the end, you make most people kind of happy, and then that's good policy. But when I talked to like everyone in East Asia, nobody described it that way. And actually, when I came back with the new idea and talked to folks in the US, they also said, oh, yeah, it really works like the way you're describing in East Asia too. And the easiest way to describe this for those in the audience that have been to Japan or elsewhere is in the US, if you talk to someone, they will give you a meishi, they'll give you a business card, and it will represent their name and one business. And if you get a conversation kind of walks around, they're like, oh, but I'm also like on the board of directors of this NGO, and they'll pull out another business card and give you another business. Oh, but I'm also like part of this startup company, and I advise them sometimes, and they give you a business card. So you'll have like 3 business cards for one person. And in Asia, you get one business card, and it's got like all their little thingies on it. In fact, in Japan, sometimes you have to flip it over because I got so many things. They're like on the front and on the back, all the little things. So the people that you'll talk to actually wear a bunch of hats. So when you get the person in the room, so you get your, let's say, KO chemist who knows about soil pollution, and you bring him in the room because he's a soil pollution expert. But it turns out you also bring him in the room because you know that his wife works for the oil industry. And so he kind of knows about the oil industry. And you also bring him in the room because he sits on the board of directors of an anti-soil pollution NGO. And you also bring him in the room because he is, connected to a startup business. And so he's not just in the room for his sort of apolitical technical expertise. He's also there because he's connected to all these different points of view. And in many cases, it wasn't just the academic, it was many of the other people that were in the room are chosen to be in the room to have the conversation around what's the soil level of pollution that we should allow. They're brought there not for the stake that they're going to fight for, but for the connections that they have and the perspective that they had because of these multiple connections. So that was the sort of, that's the groundwork of the the connected stakeholder model, is that the people in the policymaking process are connecting all the stakeholders to each other.
So, maybe this reflects my limited knowledge in this area, but normally when I hear advocacy and environmental advocacy, I'm thinking of tree huggers or people who make a lot of noise or occupy something or hold up a ship or something like that. But the ones that you're talking about are they more like desk people, or are they? And then the question that I'm actually getting at is, reading your book, it sounds as if your strategies are actually suggesting that making a lot of noise and making a lot of, or interrupting things or sitting on trees may actually not be as effective as some of the more, these network strategies. So can you talk a little bit about those 2 sides of advocacy?
Sure. So my research did find that. So my research found that making a lot of noise and protesting and having a big public protest is not as effective. When you measure effectiveness as the number of times you do the thing and did you get the thing in the end, right? But as one of my interview subjects, Barbara Finnemore, who sort of ran the Natural Resource Defense Council in China for many, many years, she's a lawyer by training and was involved in a lot of the hazardous waste and nuclear law, anti-nuclear lawsuits in the US. And she made me think about it differently, these sort of confrontational strategies that get a lot of press, especially in the US. And she made me realize that those strategies are more like venture capital. So they're not that effective, like every time you do it. Most of the time when you do it, you're going to fail, right? You're going to do it a lot, and mostly you're going to fail. But a couple of times when you do it, you might win really big. And when you win really big, it makes up for all the times you failed. And so that's the way my thinking has changed about these more confrontational, more noise making, less successful in terms of time used versus outcome strategies, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad idea to do them, just like just because you discover that venture capital is high risk doesn't mean you shouldn't do any venture capital. But it does mean if you're a small NGO and you've got $100, venture capital might not be the way to put it, right? Like your $100 should maybe go into a community gardening event that you can then leverage into a town-wide community garden that then can be a region-wide community garden that then can turn into a statewide, community gardening outcome that then can become national policy. Or like one of the other campaigns that I really loved was the 26-degree campaign in Beijing, which very small handful of NGOs in Beijing with like basically zero budget went out and measured the temperature of hotels and said, it's too cold. It's the summer. We need to retain, save energy. And so they just publicized it a little bit. And then the hotels changed, and then the city changed, and then the national government changed. And now it's like policy across all of China with this whole handful of people. And it was not big, ugly protests. It was small people working with companies to do something we wanted to do anyway, which is save energy because then they don't have to spend so much money. So that's a better way to spend your $100 if you only have $100. The venture capital is not likely to pay off. It might pay off, but it's more of a gamble.
So that's a great segue into the policy making. We have a few questions here from the audience about democracy and electoral processes. Let me read Mike's. This is actually my colleague, Mike. How important are electoral processes to environmental policy change? So South Korea, he says, had a major election in 2020 that brought in many environmentally leaning legislators. Japan's LDP has had no such electoral turning point. To what extent does this variation sort of affect what your cases that you've observed?
That's a great question. So one of the first things that I did, as you can probably imagine, when I started this process was like, what does the environmental politics in these countries look like? What was the trajectory? Where did it start? So in all the countries, it started as anti-pollution protests. So they had rapid industrial development, which led to a whole ton of pollution. And then people are like, I am dying, my kids are dying, and I can't harvest my fish or my crops. And so they protest. And interestingly, that protest in Japan happened it happened actually pre-war, and then it happened in the 50s, 60s, after Japan was democratized, but the LDP was in power. And the LDP in 1970 is known as the pollution diet, got ahead of this wave. So they could see the political pressure at the local level, lots of the local and gubernatorial and city was being won over by non-LDP people. And the LDP in Tokyo were like, we gotta get ahead of this. And so they moved way ahead. In South Korea and Taiwan, these protest movements happened under in the pre-democratic period, under the military system. And they merged with the pro-democracy movement. So in South Korea and Taiwan, the environmental movement and the democracy movement merged and won, right? Both of those countries democratized in the late 80s. And so in both South Korea and Taiwan, for decades, the environmental movement, like in the United States, got very tied to one party. So when that party was in power, they did great. And then when that party was out of power, they were screwed. They had access, they couldn't get in, they couldn't have any voice in at all. And so actually when I was doing interviews in both South Korea and Taiwan in 2010, so conservative parties were in power in both countries in 2010. The environmental advocates that I talked to in Beijing had more access to their government than the ones in Taipei and in Seoul.
Wow.
So then, there's Green parties win in both countries. And so then they're on the inside. And in Seoul, so when I was there in 2010, the environmental advocates in Seoul were telling me they're going to double down. And what they're going to do is get the liberals elected. We're just going to get the liberals elected and then we'll figure it out. Whereas the environmental advocates in Taipei were saying, I'm not sure this is working. People are tired of the protests. The DPJ, we got them in power, But then they did, no, I'm sorry, not the DPP, the DPP, not the DPJ. We got the DPP in power, and then as soon as they were in power, they just ignored us. And they like made all friendly with the corporations. And so actually we might need to do a little bit more of a Japan or China style, and do a little bit more like policy research, working with the government, pilot programs, working with, and less of this protests in the street, politicized stuff. So that was a long answer to the question of politics matters. The elections matter in the democratic countries, but they don't matter exactly the way you think they might.
So this is super interesting because the LDP, I mean, there's a lot of research that you political scientists know much more about than I do, but you know, there's this interesting thing about the LDP having been in power for 50 some years, is that even a democracy? And the answer, I think, to that is that in many issue areas, not just environment, it's also small firms and social policies, and the LDP had a very good instinct around preempting unrest and give that group something. You know, whether that's loan programs for small companies or, you know, support measures for tiny little places, or, you know, so we could probably come up with a list of 10 or so things. And that's why we see so few noisy, really noisy protests in Japan, because they're often sort of answered very early on, which is actually a very clever strategy. So thank you for making that clear and bringing that to our attention. Saori asks whether these groups learn something transnationally. So is there a diffusion of these strategies?
Yeah, that's a great segue, because it's definitely diffusion of the strategies, and they actually work together. So we're seeing many, many more, like actually that example of the Kitakyushu one, that's a transnational, right? These are networks that are going transnationally to try to do the innovation. But so China 10 years ago was facing the most intense version of these protests, right? Like the same, lots of environmental protests, lots of people in the street, lots of pressure against the anti-pollution, and that's risen, right? There's a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to solve this pollution problem. And you can bet that the Chinese government looked at what happened in South Korea and Taiwan and said, not here. And how do you make sure that it happens not here? You follow the LDP model. So it's not just the advocates will learn repertoires. There's sort of a lot of learning. I have some stories in the book of sort of use of celebrities and use of music, and especially use of art and other sort of social media connections and ways of disseminating information. Those spread really fast across the whole region, but the governments also learn for good and for ill. So they share, you know, good information. And right now the Chinese government is working to be as hard and as fast and move as fast as it can to try to get ahead of these environmental concerns. And we don't yet know whether it's going to work. It's definitely trying.
So Robbie has a, I guess it's a little bit of a footnote question to your earlier comment. He says how did the KMT's response to the sunflower movement impact environmental policy? So that's a complicated question. Making you think.
That is a complicated question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it, actually.
So maybe not.
I don't know. It was very complicated. Like, so you mentioned I was in Hong Kong as a visiting scholar actually in 2018, 2019, which was an amazing time to be in Hong Kong. I had a great time. So I was there when the protests erupted in Hong Kong. Yes, you might have noticed. I was in Japan when the earthquake happened. I was in Hong Kong. Yeah, it's not me, I promise. Correlation, not causation. I did not cause any of these things. So, and that summer, right? So January 2020 were the Taiwanese elections. And in early summer 2019, the DPP, they were going down, like they were going nowhere. They were super unpopular, nobody like that, right? But then this stuff happened in Hong Kong, and the Chinese were aggressive towards Taiwan, and the Taiwanese were like, oh my gosh, never mind about the KMT. So I think the really hard part about the sunflower movements and the environmental movements is this China factor, especially recently, is really influencing the way people are responding electorally in Taiwan. And so, especially in 2020, I do not think they were voting based on the environment. Like there was something else that was driving their electoral decisions. And that has been true in a couple different, many cases.
So yeah, this is super interesting, right? So let's go to the tough part here, and there we have 3 or 4 questions about regimes and political ideology. Yoshi asks, and I'm going to give you them all. You can sort of pick or combine them. So Yoshi asks, how do you think about the role of political ideology in environmental politics? And whether that's same as, whether East Asia is in any way different. And Jessica asks a slightly similar thing, which is, do regime types matter? And you mentioned this originally in your introduction, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, right? And so there's the obvious question, is China different, yes or no? But also all of these, as you write about, and you say this in your book, all of these countries are developmental states where business always comes first, right? And so is that more important than actually the regime type, or what is actually important in terms of allowing advocacy? Actually, there's another question related to this by Thomas, who thinks, are these really democracies in the way that we would either? Is Japan really a mature democracy, or is there something else going on? So I'm throwing a lot at you. So.
That's good. Those are great. So the last one, is it Thomas?
Yeah.
So is Japan really a democracy? Read my earlier book, Building Democracy in Japan. So I argue very strongly that Japan is definitely a democracy. It is not an American democracy. So it's not an American democracy hanging out in Japan. It's a Japanese democracy. And just like if you go to Germany, you will also find that the Germans do not practice American democracy, but they do practice democracy. So I encourage you to read that book about is Japan a democracy? The Building Democracy in Japan book is good for that. To the questions of regime type, that was fascinating. So I was flabbergasted, right? Like I designed the study because I expected to find that democracy should matter. And it just cannot be true that democracy does not matter, right? It just cannot be true. Like on the face of it, that just cannot be true. And so what I found was, as I dug deeper, and I actually have a slide for this that I'll show in just a minute, what I found was that democracy did not matter in terms of what strategies were effective, as I articulated. So the strategies that worked, like what advocates did to get success most often, that didn't matter where you were. Like those strategies worked no matter where you were. So the strategies for good, effective advocacy, that was the same. The thing that was different was what happened if you failed. That was very, very different. So if you're in Japan and you protest the new whatever plant that you don't want in your town and you lose, you and your buddies go out for a beer and you're sad and you drink your beer, and then the next day you go out and protest again on some other thing. And in South Korea, Taiwan, if you do the same thing and you lose, you go home, you have a beer, you sad with your buddies, and depending on who you are, there may be some sanctions. So in both Taiwan and South Korea, I talked to academics who were blacklisted by the government. So they had no access. They knew they were blacklisted, they were told, and they didn't have access to government grants. They couldn't get certain interviews. They couldn't do certain things. So there was a little bit of a repercussion to South Korean, Taiwanese advocates who failed. In China, if you advocate for something and you lose, really bad stuff can happen to you. So you can disappear, you can get thrown in detention for a while, you could get put under house arrest, you could be harassed, bad stuff can happen to you if you fail. And so my book was studying success and the cases of failure were not that many, so I couldn't really say something substantial about failure. But I came away from the study deciding that someone should study failure, because I think kind of like the things that lead to failed states are not just the opposite to the thing that leads to sustainable development. Like successful, sustainable states, it's not just a continuum for success to failure, and you just move further along, you get more successful, and you move further along, you get failure. Like the dynamics that lead to failed states are really different than the dynamics that lead to successful ones. And I think the same is true for advocacy. So the slide I want to share was statistically, so I dug into this in that data set that I mentioned, and I used the Freedom House data set because it went way back. So some of the stories were about really old things, and Freedom House goes far back, and it separates out these two measures of democracy. One is political liberties, which are essentially elections, and one are civil liberties, which has more to do with the rule of law and freedom of expression. And you'll notice here, if you look at it for a minute, that political liberties, at least in my data, did not have anything to do with success. Like you can see, it's like random. Success goes up, it goes down. The failure goes up, it goes down. The mix is up and down. Like political liberties and the being able to do elections didn't matter that much. Civil liberties did matter. The more civil liberties you have, you can see the gray lines, the better your chance of success. The fewer civil liberties you have, the higher chance of failure. And then mixed moves around, but especially in the really failed, really unfree places, you end up with a lot of mixed outcomes. So
what does that mean? Does it mean that in places with fewer civil liberties, it's they do less, or they do it differently? They're not as aggressive, or what's your story here? What
so I'm not sure, right? I didn't dig into this that much, but the way I started to understand it was to try to think about a place like Singapore, where the rule of law is quite strong. So you don't have a lot of electoral freedom, but the rule of law is pretty strong. And so then there's consistency in doing advocacy. So there's like rules around the advocacy. It's clear that there's a channel that you can pursue to do your advocacy, and that the sanctions against doing something wrong are prescribed by law, right? You're not likely to disappear or have your family harassed if you do your environmental advocacy and then fail in Singapore, right? So I think places like, there are places where your rule of law is protected, enable the channels of advocacy to be more understandable for all parties, so that it's easier for advocates to channel their advocacy in ways that'll work. Whereas electoral systems don't offer that necessarily. Like you can, like, I mean, look at the US, the big mess in the United States. So your electoral politics doesn't offer the same kind of support for your capacity to do advocacy well.
Wow, that is just fascinating. I'm concerned that time is running out. I could go on for hours. I'm learning so much. It is just absolutely terrific. So I'm going to ask the final question, which is actually from Professor Hugh Patrick, who has asked me to ask this question to every single speaker I have on the show. And the question is, what worries you most about Japan? So if you think about the environmental advocacies in Japan, the environmental movement in Japan, is there anything that stood out for you where you're saying business will always win, or the nuclear is going, whatever the thing is, or it won't reach the level? Is there anything that you're concerned about with all of the research you've done there?
That's a great question. I guess I'm a little worried not just about Japan, but also about sort of the other advanced countries. I'm writing something right now, and I'm doing work looking comparatively about air pollution politics. So in the other three countries, there's like a lot of activism around air pollution, and there just isn't all that much around air pollution in Japan. And there also isn't all that much around air pollution in the US. And that's because our air has gotten good enough. So I am a little worried that there's going to be a kind of good enough feeling where it's kind of good enough. Like, I'm no longer dying. The air is no longer so bad that I'm like dying. Like, the asthma is like, it's not that great, but it's not that bad. And the places where it's bad are the marginalized communities. And so we don't have to listen to them. And so I'm a little bit, this is what happens in the US, right? So it's like poor, Black, or indigenous communities. That's where you're seeing the environmental problems. And they're screaming. They're screaming. But they don't have a lot of political power. And the people in power are like, we don't really care about you. It's good enough for me. And so I'm just not going to worry about you. So I think that's my worry, is that with like a lot of things in Japan, they've done a fabulous job of bringing everybody up to a certain level. And then some people can go pretty high, but there are still people that are really down at the bottom of that level. And it's true, it's not as bad as it was at the depths of Minamata. Like, there's nobody in Japan who's suffering like that anymore, thank the Lord. But there are still people who are not in good shape. And I'm a little bit worried, not just in Japan, but elsewhere, that things for most people get good enough that they relax too much and they stop working. That said, as the book says, I had a lot of hope. I was really encouraged to see so many people doing so much on so many different levels across the whole region. And so I'm not that worried about the problem.
That's great. Thank you for turning this to a good note. There's a lot to think about. Thank you very much, Professor Mary-Elise Haddad. It was wonderful to have you, and I learned so much. I now have to go and kind of think about this for a while. So everybody, stay safe until next week, when we will meet again and shift the topic to business and e-commerce and digital marketing in Japan. So see us again next week. Until then, stay safe, take good care, and thank you again, Mary-Elise. It was great to have had you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.